Good morning. I apologize for the little glitch. We seem to have been stuck on the chat roll, and so people couldn't log in. So please let me know that you can actually get in. Sandra, would you let me know if the video is going and everything's good? Thank you. How is everybody? Yes, Susan, we are super organized. Fingers crossed. We've created this training for the ADHD brain. So I want you all to just take a deep breath and relax because I promise you, I am going to make this so easy. It's going to be like Hansel and Gretel and the witch. Remember with the breadcrumbs that she kind of leads you to where you need to be at any time that we're doing anything. So just breathe. It will not be confusing. One of the comments that I get repeatedly on 5 days, A-OK too, but 5 days specifically, is that we make this so user-friendly for the ADHD brain. Okay, so let's start. Let me know where you're joining us from, if you wouldn't mind. I got to tell you, I haven't announced this officially. I haven't announced it in public. I've told a few friends, but I am writing a book for HarperCollins Morrow. And I believe it's going to be called ADHD for Smartass Women. So what that means is that I have not done anything the whole summer. So I haven't hosted any trainings. I haven't really worked with any, of my AOK students. I haven't done much of anything but head down working on this book. And there is nothing like doing something for 2.5 months that you're not particularly good at and you've never done before to completely trash your confidence. So I got to tell you, I have been so looking forward to coming back for these trainings because it's what I love to do most. And I can actually see in record time how much of a difference what we do makes to a lot of women with ADHD. And so I feel so blessed that I get to do this. I just feel like I got to be doing something besides writing that book. And you know how the ADHD brain works, right? So you really can only write maybe 4 to 5 hours a day. And so what do? I leave it until the very last possible moment because it's really difficult for me. And I've gotten better. I've gotten a lot quicker. But still, I was thinking I could have been doing all these other things and doing the book as well. I didn't need to take 2 months off. So I'm just so excited to be here. So Angela, welcome from Chino, California, and Michelle from Aurora, Illinois. Brenda from Canada, Brunswick, Canada, and Karen from Knox, Kentucky. Alexandra from Red Deer, Alberta, and Victoria from New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Jen Wust from Whidbey Island in Washington. I am just so delighted to have all of you here. It's such a privilege. Okay, so I am Tracy Otsuka, and I am going to be teaching a series of 3 trainings over this next week. And then I'll also be going into our pop-up Facebook group live with Q&As. So you're going to give me your questions, and I'm going to answer your questions, right? I want to be, I'm going to be getting to know you, and hopefully I'm adding as much value to your life as I possibly can. So just so you all know, I'm all about transparency and authenticity. So I want to let you know that after our training, towards the end of our week, I am going to introduce you to my Your ADHD Brain is A-OK system, which is all about figuring out who you are, what you value, what your strengths, passions, and purpose are, but specifically all of those questions for the ADHD brain. Still, I wanted to make sure that regardless of whether or not you join us for A-OK, that I am providing something of real value to you this week. And so I thought long and hard on what that could be. And I came to the conclusion that if I could help you change your self-concept, your opinion about your ADHD, and consequently yourself, if I could teach you how to fall in love with your ADHD brain, that I would be doing good in the world and making a difference in your life. So in my opinion, life comes down to 2 questions. Who do I have the courage to become? and how many people can I help? So, teaching you how to fall in love with your ADHD brain, it just made a lot of sense to me. So, I know how your ADHD brain works. Let me start by giving you the lay of the land. Training number one is going to be today. It's going to be all about understanding ADHD in women. How does it show up differently for us? Training number two is going to be on Wednesday, and I'm going to show you how to create your very own ADHD user's manual. This is going to be your own formula for really learning how to understand and appreciate your ADHD brain. On training number three is going to be on Thursday, and I'm going to talk to you about what you need to answer that big question that those of us with ADHD seem to ask more than anyone else. What do I do with my life? Right? We're going to discuss confidence and action and how, for those of us with ADHD, they're integrally related to motivation. So, my team and I, we've created these free trainings, corresponding worksheets, and a community to really put what you're going to learn into practice, into action, right? So, I want you to dig in for 5 days, do the work, and I promise you that you're going to start to appreciate, respect, and dare I say, fall in love with your ADHD brain. So, first of all, Sandra, can you please post the link for the workbook? Now, the workbook is really great. Let me show you what it looks like. You know what? I just realized I didn't turn off my phone. Let me turn off my phone. There we go. Okay. So the workbook looks like this. And the whole reason for the workbook is just to kind of keep you on pace, because I know how our minds can wander. And there's certain things I talk about. Like one of them specifically is today, we are going to be talking about the symptoms of adult ADHD. And so I put in Dr. Russell, let me see, Dr. Russell Barkley's scale. And so instead of writing all these things down, just know you can go to the workbook and there is a worksheet there that you can fill out to figure out, okay, what are the symptoms that I personally have that are related to ADHD or potentially ADHD. Okay, so the trainings are going to be Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. We are going to have replays. That is the number one question I get asked all the time. Yes, there will be replays. I'd like you to allot 75 minutes for those three trainings. So on each day, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. The Q&As are going to be on Tuesday and Friday. Those are not going to be here. They're going to be in the Facebook group. And again, they are going to be at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So we're going to be together every single day this week, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. The Q&As are going to be 60 minutes. Sometimes I go over, but I'm really going to try to stick to the 60 minutes. I have Sandra here, Sandra Centurino, who helps me and runs all of my tech for these live events, and she is like that taskmaster, with the whip, trying to make sure that I stay within my allotted time, because you know how we can be, and I know that you all have other things that you want to do and get on with. So I'm really focused on trying to stay within that time frame. After this training, I am going to send you a Q&A form. I'm going to need your name, your email, and the question you have. Now, your sisters, all of us here, we all have ADHD, or we suspect we have ADHD, right? I have ADHD. Please don't send me a whole page question. Because what I'm going to do is read your question in my Facebook Live, right? And that means all of the ADHD women that are in the Facebook group are going to have to listen to your question. And I'm terrified because I think we have 3,000 of you who have signed up. And so I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions, right? So there's a much greater chance that I will answer your question if it's concise, if it's simple, and if it's relevant. So, questions that I look at and I say, I bet you many ADHD women want the answer to that question. So the last thing I want to say before we start is join the Facebook group, please. Sandra, could you please post the link to the Facebook group? As I said, we have over 3,000 women signed up. But I think there's only 1,200 of you in the Facebook group. Now, we're going to talk about community today and how important community is. And this is not like our big, giant 75,000 member Facebook group. This is a relatively small Facebook group. And we have had women meet women from all over the world in previous 5-day trainings. So join the Facebook group. Community is so important. When you see that there are other women that are just like you, struggling with exactly what you're struggling with, you realize that, oh, it's just a different brain. So let's figure out some workarounds instead of all the shame that comes from beating ourselves up, right? Finally, share your insights throughout the week with the hashtag 88. What is it called? Hashtag I love my ADHD brain. This is a way to continue to build community and cut down the shame that's associated with ADHD. I love when you tag me in your stories, and I will do my very best, stories and posts, to share them. Okay, so are you all ready to go? So, Artie, it is whatever you need it to be. So she asked, does it help with executive function skills? Definitely, if you participate and create your own ADHD user's manual, which we're going to do together on Wednesday, right? Wednesday. Yeah. On Wednesday. Absolutely, it will. So stick with us. Tanya, I'm sorry I'm late. Got distracted with my hyper focus. Yep. We understand. We understand. Okay, so are you all ready to go? I'm getting distracted by your questions and I want to jump in and answer all of them. But look, we're already at 10:13. So we're going to go. Okay? Sorry, I'm trying to set up my screen so that I can see the chat and I can also see our slides. Okay, let me know. Can you see the slides? So if someone has the link to the workbook, would you do me a favor and post that in the chat? It looks like people are having having a problem with the one that was linked. Okay, everybody can see the slides. So, you may have showed up today feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, maybe broken, and like you just want to give up. Perhaps you're even ashamed of your ADHD brain. But there's a little piece of you that knows that there's something really special about you and that you do have so much potential, but you don't know where to even start. Some of you may not even believe that you have strengths. Well, my job over the next 5 days is to show you how your brain works, because once you understand it, you too will come to love and appreciate it. And I suspect that there are some of you here who already are in love with your ADHD brain and you just want to learn more. Perhaps you're looking for more workarounds, additional workarounds for your quiver. You're looking for some more positive emotion, a feeling of solidarity. Well, you're in the right place too. So, regardless of your situation, I can help you. I've run this training now. I think it's our fifth time. I know it's our fifth time. And every time I'm told again and again how life changing it is by so many of them, so many of you. So, who am I? Well, my name is Tracy Outsuka, and I am the professed make limoncello out of lemons woman. Being an eternal optimist is often an ADHD trait. Well, I am the eternal optimist. I believe that whether you think you can or think you can't, you're absolutely right. I write for Attitude Magazine, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm writing a book for HarperCollins Moro, which is due out in fall of 2023. My favorite article for Attitude Magazine, though, is one in which I crown myself the peddler of hope. I pride myself on seeing the strengths in ADHD women before they even see them in themselves. I'm proud to have been called the fairy godmother for ADHD women by none other than Dr. Edward Hallowell, the leading authority on ADHD and co-author of both Driven to Distraction and now ADHD 2.0, a fabulous book. I'm also the host of the podcast ADHD for Smartass Women. We're right around 3.5 million downloads, and thanks to many of you, in the top 0.5% of all podcasts worldwide on any subject. I'm also the founder of the Facebook group of the same name, ADHD for Smartass Women, where we're over 75,000 members at this point. I've taken hundreds of ADHD women through my coaching program, Your ADHD Brain is A-OK, where I help them figure out what they should do with their life. We call it A-OK. A-OK has been built specifically for the ADHD brain using my patented cartography system. If you follow my podcast, you know that I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, a lifelong student, and an ADCA certified ADHD coach. I was diagnosed with ADHD 8 months after my 12-year-old son Marcus was diagnosed. Here's Marcus at 7. Here he is at 16. And here's a more recent one. Marcus is a junior now at NYU, and he just completed his first investment banking summer internship. The fact that Marcus ended up in college at all was no easy feat. He went to 3 high schools in 4 years. For years, everyone thought he was lazy because you could tell how smart he was when he spoke, but he was severely underperforming. I would regularly hear from his teachers, how can a child who's so bright be so unmotivated? He wasn't unmotivated. He struggled like most of us with ADHD with poor executive functions, the ability to plan, schedule, emotional dysregulation, most of which he's now excellent at, by the way. Struggling with the executive functioning, just like ADHD, has nothing to do with intelligence. When Marcus was diagnosed, I thought ADHD meant you were destined for failure. You were all over the place and not very smart. I didn't see these symptoms in Marcus at all. I knew how bright and ambitious he was. He was the kind of kid who always asked those second and third level questions. He wouldn't just take the first answer, he always had more questions. Teachers regularly told me that they loved him because he was quick and funny and understood their jokes. But still, from 5th grade on, he often struggled. He was consistently inconsistent. He'd get A's and C's, sometimes F's, often in the same subject in the same week. Recently, he was re-diagnosed with ADHD, but also dyslexia, something we had all suspected for a decade and consistently asked about. He was also diagnosed with visual processing disorder. Again, the fact that Marcus ended up in college at all was a miracle. Marcus's initial ADHD diagnoses made no sense at all to me, so I started doing the research. The first thing I did was hire a psychologist who was supposedly an expert in children and ADHD. I wanted to learn everything I could about the subject. However, in our second meeting, this psychologist pulled my husband and me aside and told us that our job as Marcus's parents was to reduce his expectations so he wouldn't be disappointed in life. He was far too ambitious for her liking. Sandra, are you seeing the slides move? Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I see that Sydney was having a problem. Actually, no, it wasn't Sydney. I don't know who it was. The chat moves too fast. So anyway, that was the beginning of the beginning. Now I had to learn everything I could about ADHD myself. I no longer trusted my local experts, and unfortunately, most everything out there I found focused on our ADHD weaknesses, and it just didn't make sense to me given what I already knew about my son. That's when I found Doctors Ned Hallowell and John Rady's book, Driven to Distraction. By my second reading, many months after the first, I finally put 2 and 2 together when I discovered that drivenness is actually a form of hyperactivity. I thought to myself, if I was interested in something, I was nothing if not totally driven. By golly, my son got his ADHD from me. My ADHD just looked different than his. Unlike my son, I did pretty well in school, but I always had to work harder than everyone else. I was and am definitely hyperactive. I wouldn't stop talking as a child. Some would say I still haven't stopped talking. By the way, that's me in the very middle. My father used the word impetuous to describe me. I think he meant impulsive. I would definitely shoot my mouth off when I didn't agree, but I danced ballet 6 days a week, which did wonders for my brain. The joke in my family was you can't tell Tracy any family secrets because she'll share them with anyone who'll listen. They called me the Burlingame Blab. The town we lived in was called Burlingame. And that got me thinking, what if my parents would have been told to reduce my expectations? What would have happened to me? Would I have gone to college, law school, graduate law school? And why would you ever try to reduce any child's expectations? Ever? I kept asking myself if what they say is true about ADHD and all the weaknesses we supposedly have. How did I get through school and how did I start all these businesses? And how was my life, by and large, relatively successful, even if it was kind of all over the place and didn't quite connect or make sense to many? It was so depressing reading about all the things that I shouldn't have been able to do. It made me question, did I even have ADHD? That's when I started to realize that there were medical experts in ADHD who also had ADHD. Experts like Edward Hallowell, John Rady, Kathleen Nadeau, Ellen Littman, Patricia Quinn, Roberto Olivardia. And they graduated from places like Harvard. None of this made any sense. So, you know what? It's a really good place to start. So, training number one is all about understanding ADHD in women. But first, let's find out what ADHD even is. In ADHD, ignorance is public enemy number one. Sadly, most healthcare professionals, they have no idea what ADHD looks like. And even if they studied it way back when, most of what they've learned is no longer relevant or even true today. So let's start with what is ADHD not? ADHD is not that you're stupid, that you're slow, that you're ditzy, that you're crazy. It does not mean that you can't learn. To the converse, we actually tend to be lifelong learners, but we have to discover how we best learn. And usually, the way the school system teaches is not the best way for us. It also doesn't mean that you're necessarily bouncing off the wall. Some of us are. I am, but not all of us. For many of us, the hyperactivity moves to our brains in the form of rumination and overthinking. 20% of women have purely inattentive ADHD. The most important thing that you need to know, especially if you're a parent, is that ADHD is not a behavioral disorder. You can't blame bad parenting, teachers, laziness, TV, video games, smartphones, the times we live in, a lack of discipline, or a bad diet. ADHD is an executive functioning challenge based in biology. ADHD can be the reason a brilliant human never finds success in life. It can also cut life expectancy drastically. So there are some real negatives if it's not treated. That said, ADHD is the most treatable of all psychiatric conditions once you know about it. ADHD also does not mean that you're unsuccessful. What do you think all these women have in common? Serena Williams, Mel Robbins, Erin Brockovich, Zoe Deschanel, Ellen, Chelsea Handler, Lisa Ling, Emma Watson, Whoopi Goldberg. If you're a member of our Facebook group, ADHD for Smartass Women, or you listen to my podcast of the same name, you know that our community of women with ADHD includes all kinds of women, and that includes our non binary friends as well. From writers to healthcare workers, professors, musicians, doctors, lawyers, women who manage budgets in the billions, and those whose businesses have sales in the millions. ADHD women are in all walks of life, and we are brilliant. ADHD women are often entrepreneurs. I've seen stats that indicate that 50% of all entrepreneurs have ADHD. Personally, I think it's higher. And this makes sense because we're creatives whose biggest strength is ideation. If we're hyperactive impulsive, we're also usually fearless too. We like the unknown. It usually doesn't freak us out. So starting our own businesses, going out there without a safety net, we think, why the hell not? So, what is ADHD? ADHD is a neurobiological condition, and it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. But it's misnamed. It's not a deficit of attention. We have a surplus of attention. We notice so much. We're also not all hyperactive. Remember, some of us are inattentive. I also don't think it's a disorder. I will agree to the term condition begrudgingly if I have to, but I believe that ADHD is simply a brain difference. With the right workarounds, with the right education, with the right community, possibly with some medication if you're among the lucky 70 to 80% and it works for you, we are brilliant. But the deal is there needs to be a comprehensive strategy. None of this just prescribing medication and doing nothing else because it's not enough. ADHD is a brain based condition that looks a little different for everyone. And that's what makes it so hard to diagnose, but even to question if you might have it. People don't understand what it is. Neuroscience, however, points to very real differences in the ADHD brain or neurodivergent brain versus the neurotypical brain. So, hold on, let me see if I can pop in here. There I am. Um, Go to your workbook, and we're going to go to page 4. And the fill in the blank is ADHD is a brain based condition that looks a little different for everyone. Okay. So the deal is that there are differences in the way the ADHD brain regulates attention, stimuli, and behavior. And these differences impact self regulation, how we experience motivation, how we start when we don't want to start something like homework or paying bills, or stop behaviors that we don't want to stop. It's this yin and yang, a kind of dance that is so different in the ADHD brain. Look, we may have real problems with working memory, forgetting an appointment today, or frankly, why I just walked into a room, but have no problems at all with memory in other tasks. There's a meme that everyone with ADHD has probably seen at one time or another. So, there's this picture of a light switch, right? And there's these two options. We're either utterly obsessed or we're completely uninterested. There's no in between. And this is such a great analogy. Again, our ADHD brains have two speeds and not much in between. ADHD also involves our prefrontal cortex, which is in the front of the brain, which affects our executive function skills like planning, scheduling, time management. Many of us, like me, have no sense of time, right? 15 minutes and 4 hours, it often feels exactly the same. Our ADHD brains, they're inefficient in these areas. And yet, remember, ADHD looks different in everyone. Again, this is what makes it so hard to diagnose. Some of us struggle with time, others don't. Some struggle with emotion, some don't struggle with emotion at all. You should know, however, that ADHD is not rare. It occurs in at least 5% of the population, that's children and adults, and that number is probably a lot higher because guess what? Those who are successful, we don't get diagnosed. We now know that you don't outgrow ADHD, although that's what used to be taught, right? Because ADHD was all about hyperactivity. And so when kids grew up, you'd see less hyperactivity of the body, but that was then substituted with hyperactivity of the mind. ADHD is sometimes misdiagnosed, but it is still seriously underdiagnosed, especially for women. There's a lot of misinformation. Thank you, Teresa. Despite the fact that the existence and impact of ADHD has been validated for decades by the National Institute of Health, the US Surgeon General, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatry Association, and there have been many brain imaging studies, genetic studies, twin studies. There is no question that ADHD exists. But this is like global warming, right? 99% of scientists say there's global warming. 99% of scientists say ADHD is real. I'm going to say something that is sadly now controversial, but friggin' follow the damn science. You either believe in science or you don't. ADHD is real. And just so you know, 90% of women who have ADHD have not been diagnosed. We'll talk about why in a bit. We all have our own unique combination of traits. It looks different in everyone. So, guess what? That means it looks different in women as well. ADHD is highly heritable. It's more heritable than anxiety disorders, and it's almost as heritable as height. So, if one parent has it, there's at least a 33% chance that the child will have it. If both parents have ADHD, there's a 66% chance. ADHD may also look completely different from person to person, even in the same family. It can also skip a generation, which means your ADHD could be inherited from a grandparent or a great aunt instead of your parents. ADHD, it's not like being pregnant, right? Where you either are or you're not. It's more like height or intelligence, where there's varying degrees and people will fall somewhere on the spectrum. That means that some of us can have symptoms that are so slight that we're not really impaired by it. If you're intelligent, you can hide it, right? You can mask, and you don't even know that you're doing it. Environmental stressors can also cause ADHD, head injuries, lack of oxygen at birth, infections, alcohol, drugs, and smoking increase the risk of a baby having ADHD. And what your ADHD symptoms look like can also depend on how you grew up. Did you struggle in school? Did you experience trauma? What I've noticed firsthand is the women who struggle the most with their ADHD symptoms also have trauma. Often, you don't know what symptoms are from the trauma and what symptoms are from the ADHD because the symptoms look so similar, right? Inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. If there is trauma in ADHD, it's so important to work with professionals who are experienced in both. Lucy, you say that you're getting weepy here. I hope that it's weepy because you're suddenly starting to realize that there are answers and it's not you. You're not all over the place. You're not unintelligent. You're not all of the bad things. Because what we're going to do this week is we are going to also figure out, okay, these may be some of the things that Lucy struggles with, right? But what are the things that Lucy is truly brilliant at? Because I think that that is exactly what starts to dissipate the shame. And so we may get teary about, oh my gosh, I wish I would have known these things before, but we're going to figure them out together. Okay. So, what does the DSM say about ADHD? The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Isn't that a lovely, lovely phrase or name? It's what, and I'm joking here, I'm being facetious. It's what mental health professionals use to diagnose mental health conditions. But I got to tell you about it, right? Because that's what the doctors use when they are trained in ADHD. So that's all they typically get. I think it's getting better, but not quickly enough. Okay, so according to the DSM 5, there are three subtypes of ADHD. The first one is hyperactive impulsive. Now, I don't know anyone who is purely this subtype. And I've asked ADHD experts from doctors to coaches to therapists, and they've all told me that it's very rare. The symptoms are purely fidgeting, talking a lot, frequently interrupting, and restlessness. The second subtype is inattention. That is where the hyperactivity is in your mind. And the symptoms are that you're forgetful, you lose things, you have trouble following directions, you have difficulty with organization. The third subtype is a combined subtype. So you've got a little bit of the hyperactive impulsive and a little bit of the inattentive. And this is the most common of all subtypes. So I am combined subtype where I have symptoms of both hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. According to the DSM 5, ADHD symptoms fall into three main areas. Number one is impulsivity. Number two is hyperactivity. And number three is distractibility. Impulsivity and hyperactivity are usually lumped together, as we saw in the preceding slide. So there are 18 symptoms to diagnose ADHD. ADHD is characterized by a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. The DSM lists 18 symptoms to diagnose ADHD. 9 are focused on inattention, and 9 are focused on hyperactivity impulsivity. Dr. Russell Barkley has developed 9 criteria specifically for adult ADHD, which I think is really useful in understanding what it might look like in us. So, and remember, this is in your workbook on pages 5 and 6. So, you don't have to feverishly write anything down. We also, I should mention, we do pull together, it's computer generated, but we do pull together a transcript. And then, of course, you will have a replay. And what we do is we put everything in what is called a hub. And I think after this live, I will go into the Facebook group and I'll show you all how the hub works. It'll take you 2 minutes to watch that video. So please do it, because I think it'll dissipate any anxiety you might have about, oh my gosh, how do I make sure that I get this information? And how do I make sure that I show up where I need to show up? Okay, so let's talk about Barkley's adult criteria. So this is the criteria. Do you often, number one, easily get distracted or by extraneous stimuli or irrelevant thought? Do you make decisions impulsively? Do you have difficulty stopping activities or behavior when they're engaging and of interest to you? Do you often start a project or a task without reading or listening to directions carefully? Do you fail to follow through on promises or commitments that you might make to others? Do you often have trouble doing things in their proper order or sequence? Do you drive much faster than others? Or if you don't drive, do you have difficulty engaging in leisure activities or doing fun things quietly? Number 8, do you have difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or recreational activities? Number 9, do you have difficulty organizing tasks and activities? So the deal is, if you check off 4 of those first 7 symptoms or 6 of the 9 that I just read through, according to Barkley's scale, you're likely to have ADHD, so you should consult a medical professional. Remember, the scale is in our workbook. Well, everyone has times where they get distracted or they act impulsively or they lose things or they can't remember why they walked into the kitchen. True, right? But what you're looking for are the number of traits that you have, the duration that you've had them. So the DSM specifies that they have to have been present for at least 6 months. The intensity that you have these symptoms. So how often are you distracted? How often do you find yourself working only to discover that it's now 2 a.m. and it feels like 9 p.m.? And finally, have your symptoms impaired you in your education, your work, your social relationships, dating or marriage, managing your money, driving? On top of all this, you have to have had these symptoms as a child. Now, the DSM says that these symptoms must be present prior to the age of 12. It used to be 7. But Barkley says that it's before the age of 16 in women. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't have ADHD. Just because you weren't diagnosed as a child doesn't mean you don't have ADHD. You may just not have recognized those symptoms as ADHD, right? And just because you have less of a problem today with these symptoms than you had as a child doesn't mean you don't have ADHD. Just because you were hyperactive as a child, but you're no longer hyperactive today, doesn't mean you don't have ADHD. Ask your parent or sibling what you were like if you can't remember. So, what does ADHD really look like? Now that we know what the DSM criteria for an ADHD diagnosis is, let's talk about what it really looks like. In short, it looks like unexplained underachievement or being consistently inconsistent, even in successful women. This sense that although you've done well, you know you're still not living to your full potential and you could do so much more. Ned Hallowell says that ADHD is a term that describes a way of being in the world. It's neither entirely a disorder nor entirely an asset. It's an array of traits specific to a unique kind of mind. So it can be an advantage or a curse, depending on how a person manages it. Our ADHD, it makes us so creative and vividly imaginative. And what is creativity? Well, according to Picasso, it's impulsivity gone right. Creativity, it's so important to us. And it's not just artistic creativity, it's also creativity of thought and how we put ideas together in ways that haven't been done before. Even scientists now agree that our ideation is our biggest strength. However, even if you're easily distracted, there are times when we're so focused that it's crazy. ADHD, you see, gives us the ability to hyperfocus. We're often highly intuitive. This is called interpersonal intuition. We can walk into a room and read it, even if we've never met the people before. We can also be highly empathetic and sensitive, which is why we often make great doctors, therapists, and coaches. We're also nonconformists, but we don't choose to not conform. Sometimes we don't even notice what the standard that we're supposed to be conforming to even is. We also love uncertainty and we're calm when others are anxious. It's why you'll find many of us working as paramedics, ER doctors, trial lawyers, chefs, fire and police officers. We don't mind not knowing where we're headed or what the outcome will be. In fact, we rather like it. We also can be eternal optimists. We see possibilities when others just see problems. We have an intolerance to boredom. Boredom, it's our kryptonite. We're endlessly inquisitive and lifelong learners. We're problem solvers. We're tenacious. I mean, there are times we should give up, but we don't. Maybe it's a skill we've developed because we've had to work so much harder. We're also enthusiastic and fun. There's no one I'd rather be around than someone with ADHD. We're also just as sensitive. We fight for others and what we believe in, sometimes to our own detriment. The key concept here around how to be successful with an ADHD brain is this one. ADHD brains are wired for interest, not information. ADHD brains are wired for interest, not information. If we're not interested, forget about it. We don't have a deficit of attention, we have a surplus of attention. Our imagination fuels our curiosity, and so we notice everything all at the same time that your neurotypical would often miss. It's not that we won't pay attention to what we're not interested in, it's that we can't, no matter how important it is that someone else think that we do so. Remember that life switch? That's the ADHD brain. There's two speeds. We're either utterly obsessed or we're uninterested. And when we're uninterested, we're just not good at whatever we're trying to get done. One other comment. Our brains are not designed to remember. This is all brains, by the way. They are designed to think. Yet we have this sense that if we can't remember things, we're somehow broken or just not smart. That is not true. As I mentioned, we're also genetically programmed to be endlessly inquisitive. And so we all have a few areas in life where we demonstrate none of the executive functioning impairments that we show in all other areas we're not interested in. Again, if we're interested, it's all good. Example: I could not be bothered to plan and cook dinner every night, but give me a dinner party and I will prepare for days. Make me fill out financial statements, do taxes, or balance a checkbook. I don't think people even do that anymore. No, I'm just not going to do it. I'm smart. I guess I could do it if I wanted to, but it is literally painful. So I don't want to do it. Now, I'm lucky. I'm married to a banker. If I wasn't, I know that those are things that I'd have to contract out. I would absolutely need help. As I mentioned, when we're interested, we also have the ability to hyperfocus. So we can get really good at things really quickly. Of the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, there isn't a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something. The key is to ask yourself, what are you really interested in? That's where you should be spending your time instead of focusing on shoring up your weaknesses. Okay, so we're going to get into ADHD and women. Um, but I just want to come in and make sure how are you all doing? Are you breathing? Um, oh my gosh, you guys are moving so quickly. Carmen says there are people who don't hear the music in stores. I hear the music in the three neighboring conversations while picking which bagels I want. I totally get that. For me, it's about smell. I just am hypersensitive to smell, right? And there are times when there can be all kinds of chaos around me and I'm working, I'm writing my book, and I love it. It becomes white noise. And then there are times that I'm tuned into every conversation that is going on around me. And I never really know when I show up, which way is it going to be? But I've learned some workarounds, which we're going to work on tomorrow to kind of get around that. So, are you all okay? What page are we on? I think we are on page, hold on. We are on page 8. Okay. So are we ready to talk about ADHD in women? Yeah. Rachel, wait, what? Ruth, there are times when the noise is too much for me, especially with kids. I hear that a lot, like hypersensitivity around, especially, child's voices. I'm the opposite. I miss chaos so much. I have my kids are both, well, one of them, Marky, right, is in on the East Coast in college, and my daughter is in her first job on the East Coast. So there's nobody here, just my little Shih Tzu. And it's so quiet. And I feel like I miss the chaos. I miss the noise. Might be my hyperactivity too. And so I'm thinking I need another dog. Probably not a smart decision, but I miss the chaos. Okay, so are we all ready to go back? Let's go back. Okay, let's talk about ADHD and women. So, ADHD has always been about the boys, right? 95% of the studies have focused on white prepubescent boys. There's definitely a gender data gap. And this makes sense, right? So they were hyperactive. These boys were oppositional, sometimes aggressive. So they were hard to handle for their parents and teachers. Boys were just more annoying, right? So they're diagnosed and the girls are missed. Hyperactive girls, on the other hand, they're chatty, which is socially acceptable. So they don't get diagnosed today. Even today, there's a general belief that only boys have ADHD. But guess what? In adults, both men and women have ADHD symptoms to a similar degree, so they have equal amounts of ADHD, yet the diagnosis rate of American men is 69% higher than it is for women. So, why is that? Because ADHD women don't comply with stereotypes around what ADHD looks like. They're not as hyperactive. Why is that? Because ADHD women are twice as likely to have inattentive ADHD than men. Okay, so let's pull out our workbook, page 8, and we are going to fill in the blank. Women are 2 times more likely to have inattentive ADHD than men. And inattentive ADHD looks different than hyperactive combined type ADHD. These women may be shy, they may be forgetful, disorganized, stressed, and daydreamy. Sometimes they seem like absent minded professors. So they're so bright in certain subjects, but they're in their head a lot. So they can't recreate their steps because they weren't in their body when they, let's say, they lost their car keys, right? Has that ever happened to you? You lose something and you have no idea where you lost it because you were so in your head and not in your body that you can't even retrace the steps that you took to find it. With inattentive ADHD, the body may appear slow and even sluggish, but the brain is moving really quickly. That said, those with inattentive ADHD make up only 10% of the total ADHD population, but most of those with inattentive ADHD are women. The majority, 90% of those with ADHD, do have combined type ADHD. You know, the biggest problem is that a very large percentage of healthcare practitioners, they're just not educated on ADHD in women and girls. Instead, girls and women are diagnosed with depression and anxiety, which may be a comorbidity of ADHD, but often it's the ADHD that actually causes the anxiety and depression. So when you treat the ADHD, the anxiety and depression resolve as well. For some, SSRIs, which you'd be prescribed for anxiety and depression, can also actually make your ADHD symptoms worse. For others, that's not true. Again, we're all different. So, why are so many women and girls misdiagnosed? Because girls tend to internalize their symptoms. Remember, we were talking about that while boys externalize them. Girls go inward, meaning their anger, their frustration, their struggle, it's kept inside of them and they're scared to tell anyone. They beat themselves up more, which of course translates into higher rates of anxiety and depression for girls and women. There's also so much bias and stigma against girls with ADHD. There are all kinds of studies have shown that when a boy and a girl present with the exact same ADHD symptoms, the boy will be referred for treatment and the girl won't. I know in our Facebook group, ADHD for Smartass Women, a huge percentage of our members were diagnosed late in life and only after their child, and usually it's a son. I conducted a poll and members stated that for 2/3 of them, it was a son that was diagnosed with ADHD. And that's certainly my story. And this is troubling because the prognosis is so much better the earlier the diagnoses. This is why it's so important that we make sure and advocate for our girls because the schools and even their doctors, they often don't know what ADHD even looks like in girls. The earlier that we can normalize their differences, that they can meet other friends who also have ADHD, so reduce their shame, right? So that they can learn and understand how their brains work, they can discover their strengths, gifts, etc., the better these girls are going to be. Another reason we need to get our girls diagnosed is because research indicates that women struggle more with ADHD than men. So why would this be? All people with ADHD must manage themselves, right? And their career. And that's often difficult enough. But ADHD women are also expected to manage the household and the children, plus their career. And guess what this requires? Yep, strong executive functioning skills. Research indicates that women struggle more with ADHD than men due to a combination of internalized symptoms, which we talked about, hormones, societal pressures, and gender role expectations. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? When women compare themselves harshly to their peers who seem to be succeeding juggling all these balls, imposter syndrome sets in. Women also struggle more with central nervous system hypersensitivities like sensory overload, somatic complaints like headaches, migraines, stomach aches, sleep difficulties. We also have more comorbidities such as anxiety. 20 to 40% of people with ADHD have an anxiety disorder, depression, dysregulated eating, personality disorders. When women are diagnosed late in life, especially if they don't know others who have ADHD, there's so much shame around it. They see their behaviors, their inability to manage the household, organize their children, have meals on the table as a character flaw or a moral failing, when really their brains just work differently. This is boring work. It's like Groundhog Day, emptying the dishwasher, washing the clothes, getting dinner on the table. When you're done, it just starts all over again. It never ends. How many times have you heard a man stress out because he wasn't good at keeping the house clean or making sure that dinner was on the table? My guess would be never. Often, I will meet an incredibly accomplished woman, but because she struggles with managing a household and kids, she can't even see herself as successful. It's so important that we stop trying to shore up our weaknesses and instead develop our strengths further. I hear all the time from ADHD women, I can't afford to hire a housekeeper. Yeah, well, you can't afford not to. Whatever you're spending on that housekeeper is going to pay off tenfold when you feel as if you're in control and you're not completely overwhelmed. What do you think that does to your brain, your sense of focus, your sense of self? We need positive emotion. If every time you walk into your home and it's a disorganized disaster and you beat yourself up for what you're just not good at, that is going to affect how you feel about yourself and those things that you really are so brilliant at. Again, do you ever hear men being ashamed of getting help around the house? No, you probably expect it, right? If they have a house that is organized and they're on top of things, you just expect that they have help. So let's talk about strengths versus weaknesses. Because you know what? It's a yin and a yang. Are you hyperactive or are you actually energetic? What about impulsive? Are you really impulsive or are you just creative? I realize impulsive is not centered in that block. I'm going to have to fix that. Are you inattentive or are you just really curious? Are you emotional or are you actually just very compassionate? Are you time blind or are you in the moment? Do you just love what you're doing in that particular moment? Are you stubborn or are you persistent? Look for your strengths. Stop focusing on your weaknesses. So that leads us to perfectionism and ADHD. Let me also mention that not all women with ADHD present as disorganized or unmotivated. For some of us, we're the absolute opposite. We have perfect homes, perfect cars. Our kids are perfectly dressed and coiffed. We overcompensate by being perfectionistic. In fact, we can't get anything done if we're distracted by an untidy anything. And this is okay until keeping up becomes an absolute burden. This is probably what my type of ADHD looks like. I was a whirling dervish until perimenopause, when all of a sudden I could no longer hold any of it together, and I couldn't figure out why. And because I was so used to performing at such a high level, when I no longer could, I felt like I was letting everyone down. And when I finally had to just say no, I was so mortified. I couldn't possibly tell anyone what was going on because I didn't know myself. Why could I do all this before and now I couldn't? Well, I'm going to tell you why. And that brings us to hormones and ADHD, specifically estrogen. You know, ADHD is thought of as a condition that remains stable throughout the lifespan. Remember, it's all about the boys, right? We now know this isn't true for women. In fact, the DSM 5 does not take women into account at all. ADHD is not a trait that stays stable in women. Daily symptoms are affected by hormone fluctuations. So you can't just apply the studies on young boys and men to women. There is almost no research on hormonal influence on women's brains, regardless if they have ADHD or not. We know that there's a huge gender gap in ADHD studies. Studies don't even include women, right? And women have generally been excluded from studies because their hormones constantly change during their cycle, and this influences so many things, those pesky hormones. So, research just ignores them and only includes males. According to Dr. Ellen Littman, who's been involved with ADHD for over 30 years, she's a psychologist in New York State. She tells us that with the very few studies that are out there, we actually do now know that estrogen and progesterone modulate neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. This directly affects the brain's executive functions, how we pay attention, our cognition, our memory, how we learn, our emotion, our sleep, focus, and motivation. These are all things that are impaired with ADHD. So, what am I saying? Estrogen impacts our dopamine levels, which in turn affects our ADHD symptoms. So, ADHD symptoms increase when estrogen decreases, and ADHD symptoms decrease when estrogen increases. And estrogen levels change dramatically during our lifespan. We have an estrogen influx beginning in puberty, which is now when we typically see ADHD in girls. I always wondered, how could I memorize anything until I was 13? And then once I hit 13, I could not remember anything, not even one verse to a song. Estrogen is also very high in pregnancy. I have never been as productive as when I was pregnant. Now, I've also heard from women who they were a mess when they were pregnant. So again, it's all unique to the individual as far as, when you do well versus when you don't do well. It drops postpartum or after pregnancy, and it drops in perimenopause. It decreases until menopause, where we spend a third of our life. With ADHD, you already have low dopamine levels in certain brain regions, right? Estrogen also peaks at ovulation, but then it plummets the week after ovulation. And this is for neurotypical female brains as well. In fact, Dr. Sandra Kuj from the University of Amsterdam cited a small study that found that even in women without ADHD, during the week after ovulation, they generally reported feeling more impulsive and more inattentive. This supports the relationship between estrogen and these kinds of symptoms for all women. So, those of us with ADHD, we're hit with a double whammy. And for women in perimenopause or menopause, often just increasing stimulant medication during that week after ovulation, it's not enough. They need hormone replacement therapy as well. They need estrogen in order for their increased stimulant medication to work. This is absolutely worth talking to your doctor about. I will tell you, sadly, it didn't work for me, but nothing ever does, which is why I have to do all of the non medication options. A new study, Kuj was also involved here as well. It came out a little over a year ago, and it concluded that premenstrual dysphoric disorder, you probably know it as PMDD, postpartum depression, and climacteric mood symptoms, these are all the symptoms that relate to perimenopause through menopause, they disproportionately impact women with ADHD. So we have more symptoms of hormone-related mood disorders, and these symptoms may be more severe than those experienced by women with ADHD. So ladies, it is not in your head. We need more studies. We need science to study hormonal mood changes throughout our life. So, is adult onset ADHD a thing? DSM-5 says that symptoms have to be present in childhood. Yet often ADHD symptoms seem like they don't show up until adulthood. We know that this happens when the demands of life exceed the ability to cope. Women after they've had their first child or second child. If you're smart, you may be fine until college or law school or medical school, but it gets harder and harder and it becomes more and more competitive. Even going from high school to college that first year, it's not uncommon for ADHD students to suddenly fall off the rails. Not only do they need to keep up with their school, but they need to get themselves fed. They need to do their laundry. They need to get into bed at a reasonable time. And the structure that they had at home and in high school that their parents provided is now gone. There are also women like me who get through all of that well enough, although I did almost flunk out of college my first year because of calculus and biochemistry. They may even raise kids and don't experience symptoms that really impact them until perimenopause. There are other women who don't experience symptoms until menopause. And I've heard the term adult onset ADHD. I've used the term maturity onset ADHD. And I suspect that these women, if they really think about it, they had symptoms at least since puberty, but they were very high functioning. Maybe their symptoms were less severe. They were in the right career. They were in the right relationships. They had a lot of structure, like Catholic school. They had resources. They had a spouse who picked up a lot of the slack. They had little, if any, trauma, at least not big T trauma. So they have much less shame and they can compensate until they can no longer compensate. So, this is the perfect segue for ADHD and emotion. Now, I want to remind you that emotion and ADHD is not mentioned in the DSM, which is again what mental health professionals use to diagnose ADHD. Yet, all real ADHD experts believe that emotion is a big part of ADHD. We also know that women, despite being much less likely to be diagnosed than men, suffer more from ADHD, especially if they're undiagnosed. Is this because they're subjected to more social rules? If they're hyperactive, they may have more gender atypical behaviors. They may be more outspoken, challenging, like to take charge, which, that's frowned upon. Regardless, ADHD women tell me that they feel more judged and misunderstood. They also feel they also struggle more with emotional reactivity, and I can tell you that that's frowned upon much more in women than it is in men. ADHD women report much more difficulty with relationships than ADHD men. Partly this is because there are also different social rules for maintaining relationships for women than men, right? Men cannot show up for a month and no one really cares. It's difficult for many of us to do the follow up that's required to maintain female friendships. In truth, there's often things we'd much rather do. We're interested in so much, and lots of times we'd rather do that than sit around and talk about things that are less interesting to us. In couples, it's also usually the woman who's expected to plan and maintain these relationships, something we're not very good at. I know when my kids were younger, it was so much easier because we would have standing get together appointments, right? Every Friday, one family in our group would host play dates. We had all these kids' events that we would regularly see each other at. And I would host a regular book group. Today, I tell my friends, it's not that I don't want to see you, but it needs to be something that's either regularly scheduled and on my calendar, or we need to pick the new date before I leave. I hate scheduling. It is the bane of my existence. So, for obvious reasons, this can cause ADHD women to withdraw from relationships and isolate. They feel like no one really knows them. They stop having an opinion because their opinions tend to ruffle feathers. They can stop trusting themselves. And the longer they go undiagnosed, the more likely they will figure out other ways to manage what they don't even know is ADHD. And this can lead to further emotional dysregulation, anxiety, depression, dysregulated eating, addiction, and personality disorders like borderline. So, how are you all doing? Okay. On top of all of this, many of us are very sensitive to criticism and rejection. We can overreact. We can harbor a lot of shame and guilt. In fact, there's an old study out of Harvard that indicates that if you have ADHD and you struggled in school, you will have received 20,000 more critical messages by your 12th birthday than someone without ADHD. I think that study was done on boys. So you can imagine what that does to someone's self concept. We can also struggle with something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. I am looking how about not experience symptoms until COVID? That was Teresa. Absolutely, Teresa. I mean, again, it's you're coping just fine. And then one more, and you're kind of balanced, right? If you think of what are those things called? The scale, right? That has two, I don't even know how to describe it, but there's two scales, right? And they balance each other out. And so you got everything stacked up there and you're managing. Things are difficult, but you're managing. And then all of a sudden you add one more thing and the scale just, completely becomes unbalanced and we struggle. Okay, so what is rejection sensitive dysphoria? We also call it RSD. RSD is the debilitating fear of rejection that is sometimes present with ADHD. Okay, so let's find your workbooks on page 10. And the fill in the blank, it's rejection sensitive dysphoria is the debilitating fear of rejection. That's the fill in the blank that is sometimes present with ADHD. So lately, I heard several doctors question whether or not RSD just comes from growing up with ADHD and trauma. And all those negative messages we were just talking about. I mean, think about it. If you're a girl, according to society, you're supposed to be better in school, right? You're supposed to sit still longer and pay attention better, be neater, have better handwriting, not be as outspoken, let alone aggressive. And what happens if you struggle to do any of it? Doesn't it make sense that over time you would suffer from a debilitating fear of rejection and that you'd believe that everything about you is wrong? I think you might. So I am getting my definition. Let's see if I can go back to these slides from William Dotson. He is a Harvard educated psychiatrist, teaches or taught at Georgetown. I think he's now retired, and he always seems to be the ADHD expert cited when mood, emotion, and ADHD are discussed. According to Dr. Dodson, RSD is the one emotional condition found only with ADHD. Because we're talking about ADHD and emotions, it's been largely ignored recently. Yet, RSD was written about regularly 40 or 50 years ago, and then it was just dropped. According to Dotson, with rejection sensitive dysphoria, the person experiences extreme emotional sensitivity or dysregulation and pain triggered by the perception, real or imagined, of being rejected, teased, criticized, a disappointment to important people in their lives, disappointment in themselves when they fail to attain their own very high standards or goals. In our podcast and in our group, I can tell you firsthand that we're talking about really bright women who know how smart they are, but somehow they can't reach their potential and they just don't know why. The pain with RSD is so extreme that people who experience it, they can't even put it into words. And by the way, dysphoria means unbearable in Greek. These women can become people pleasers to the point that they ignore their own feelings so they don't have to ever be the bad guy. They feel like nothing they will ever do is good enough. They're extremely perfectionistic, so there's no opportunity for anyone to criticize them. They refuse to even try because they don't want to leave their comfort zone. They can't bear to be rejected, to look stupid or fail, so they dumb themselves down. RSD can lead to social phobia because you feel like you're a failure. You feel like you haven't lived up to your expectations or expectations you perceive that others have of you. So you withdraw and stay away from social situations. Women with RSD can also become very angry. So why would those of us with ADHD have a low frustration tolerance, less patience, be more excitable, and have a temper? Because emotion starts in the brain, and inadequate working memory, like we see in ADHD and RSD, allows emotion to flood the brain. And when you flood, you focus on this one emotion and you crowd out all the other important information that might help you control your anger and regulate your behavior. Our prehistoric lizard brain works hard to keep us safe from saber-toothed tigers, but we're no longer in danger of being eaten by saber-toothed tigers. And intellectually, we know that, yet we still fall back into thinking we are. Humans have a bias, ADHD or not, towards negativity. And with ADHD, it can be worse. ADHD women tell me that RSD is the most debilitating of their ADHD symptoms. So they get all the ADHD symptoms and RSD. But they also tell me that once they know what it is, it's life changing because they know they're not crazy. This is not a character flaw, and they can start to implement some strategies that really work, strategies like mindfulness and other somatic therapies. We're going to talk about those tomorrow. Now, I also want to mention that ADHD and RSD is often misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. And that's because you can have the flare ups of emotion in ADHD with RSD. The difference is the flares in emotion are specific to something that has happened, and as quickly as it comes, it goes away, versus in bipolar disorder, it's internal. The emotions come out of nowhere. Bipolar rages are much more intense. They don't just go away at the drop of a hat like ADHD emotions sometimes can, or it often does. So, if you want to know more about RSD, bipolar disorder, you can go to emotion. You can go to page 11 of the workbook, where I link to other episodes of my podcast, ADHD for Smartass Women, on topics we just discussed. Is it ADHD? What does ADHD look like in women? What is RSD and ADHD and bipolar disorder, and how do they look? So, we're at the end of today. That's what I have for you today on what ADHD looks like generally, and then what it looks like in women. So now that you understand more about how your ADHD brain works, on Wednesday in training number 2, we're going to explore what you can do to help your ADHD brain be more effective, work better, feel more successful, and reduce shame. And I am going to help you build your own ADHD user's manual. I'm so sorry. Did it not? You know what? I'm going to come direct. Hold on one second. Let me just. Okay. So I am 3 minutes over. Sandra's probably got the whip going, but no, she's giving me a thumbs up. So if someone could please provide the workbook link once again, that would be great. Navolia, if you go into our Facebook group, which Sandra, could you post the link to the Facebook group again? We will have all of the links to the workbook and everything you need in there. And just when I'm done here, I'll go live into the group and I will talk to you about what the hub is, because all you have to remember is one URL for the whole week. You remember that one URL, just write it down on a Post-it note, stick it on your computer. You will always know where to go for everything, whether you're talking about the workbook, whether you're talking about the replays, whether we're talking about how do I get into the Facebook group, it will all be there. I think you guys are all catching up. I've tried, but YouTube removed the link. They removed the link for the workbook? Yes. Thank you, Joe. If you all go to the Facebook group, now if someone could post the Facebook group, you know what? Has someone posted it? Otherwise, I'll get in there and I'll post it. Thank you, Helen, so much. Okay, so the next step is, if you have any questions on this training, I am going to send you an email. So whitelist the emails. I'm going to send you an email with the link. Actually, Sandra, maybe you can post it here too. The link for the Q&A. So there is a Google form that's set up there. If you could give me your name, your email, a short question. And they come to me in a spreadsheet, and then I will go through those questions and choose the questions that I think will be most relevant. I'll try to get through as many as I possibly can, and I will do that live tomorrow in the Facebook group at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Now, I use StreamYard, and StreamYard does this wonky thing where sometimes it doesn't allow the video to come through the original StreamYard link. So if you just scroll and look for the video, you'll see us live in there. Okay. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope this was very helpful and useful to you. It is only the beginning, it's where we're laying the foundation. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about okay, so now what do we do about it? Now that we know what the issues are, how do we address it so that we can be very successful and very happy? Okay. Bye bye. Thank you.